What if God's call on your life isn't so much to do with what you can do for him, but it's more about the way in which you see things? The story of the Bible is a story full of people who were really effective in serving God because they saw things differently. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, when we think about somebody being called by God, we very often think of it in terms of a really dramatic moment, a lightning bolt from heaven or a voice from the sky or something really, really dramatic happening. Now, sometimes when God calls people, it does happen like that, but it doesn't always happen like that. And anyway, the moment of the call is not actually the really important thing. What's really important, of course, is the way it changes us and the way it changes our perspective. Because when God calls you and he calls you into discipleship and ministry, everything shifts and you see God differently, you see yourself differently, you see the world differently, you see other people differently. And that's the important thing. We're going to think today a little bit about the calling of Isaiah in chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. Now, in one sense, that was a very dramatic call, but that's not the important thing. The important thing about the story of Isaiah's call is that he began to see things differently. And because he saw things differently, so he was able to be effective for God. And when we embrace that same shift in our own lives, when we embrace a new way of seeing, then we can actually live and serve God effectively as well, right where we are. So see differently, then serve effectively. And the first thing to say is that when you are called, you learn to see God differently. Responding to God's call on your life puts him at the very center of your world. He can no longer remain as some sort of hobby or some activity that we take part in on a Sunday. Isaiah chapter 6 verse 1 begins like this: "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord." Now, King Uzziah had been reigning for 50 years. And he wasn't a model king by any stretch of the imagination, but under him there was a very strong economy, there was national stability, there was security, and the borders of the nation had expanded. But now King Uzziah was dead and the throne was empty. So the nation and the people were in this kind of space of feeling lost, feeling in chaos, not sure what the future held for them. And at that moment, Isaiah says, "I saw the Lord." And what's important here, of course, is that the throne of Uzziah was now empty, but the throne room of heaven was still full. God was still sitting on his throne. Isaiah is saying that, in the midst of all this instability, God is still on his throne. He is high and he is lifted up. Now, the reality is that each generation has its own Uzziahs. And actually, you have your own Uzziahs and I have my own Uzziahs as well. We have these things that we rely on to bring us comfort and security and stability in life. And, that may be things like money. It may be things like health. It may be our political leaders. It may be our own plans for the future. But all these things that we hold dear to ourselves and we build our lives upon, that we believe will bring us lasting comfort and stability. But the truth is that if we put these things on the throne of our lives, they don't last. They're not eternal and they will all collapse at some point or another. And the truth is that the call of God starts with a vision of who God really is. God is the one who is on the throne of our lives. He's on the throne of the universe and the whole world. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. God is sitting on the throne that will never be empty. And when you see that, and when you learn to kind of accept that reality as the building block for your life and your calling and your ministry, then you will prioritize God and you will follow him. And it's that vision of God seated on the throne of your life, as it were, that fuels everything else. So I would say to yourself, ask yourself today, who is on the throne of your life? Whose authority are you sitting under? Where are you looking for your stability and your comfort for the future? If God is at the center, then everything else will fall into place. So the first stage of being called by God and to be effective by God, to be effectively used by God, is to be able to see God differently and put him on the throne at the center of your life. The second thing about being called by God is that when you're called, you see yourself differently. In chapter 5 of Isaiah, chapter 6, Isaiah has seen this vision of God, and then he says this: "Woe to me, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips." It's really interesting, isn't it, that as soon as Isaiah captures this vision of God in all his glory, he's not drawn to celebrate. Instead, his self-identity and his self-image collapses. And that is so often the case for us, that when we see God's glory, when we see his holiness, when we get a sense of his power and his authority, then we realize how compromised we actually are. We realize just how fallen we are, how broken we are, how frail we are, how unworthy we are to stand in his presence. But the interesting thing about that, of course, is that this moment of breaking, of self-realization, isn't rejection. It's not that God sees you and he sees me in our brokenness and our fallenness and he rejects us. Instead, it's a moment of preparation for us. In this story from Isaiah chapter 6, the angel touches Isaiah's lips with a coal and he says, "Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for." We often think, don't we, I can't serve God. I'm too flawed. I'm too inconsistent. My past is too broken. But Isaiah's story flips that idea on its head, because the story of Isaiah teaches us that that it's our brokenness and our frailty where ministry actually starts. God doesn't want you to be spotless. He calls you, then he cleanses you, and then he sends you out. So I would say, don't stop at naming before God the things you've got wrong. Don't just think that God is calling you and then say, "Lord, I can't do that because I've done this in the past. I've done that in the past. I'm still struggling with this temptation. I've got this weakness. I've got this inability." Don't stop at naming your wrongdoings and your frailties and your failings. Instead, name them before God and then pause long enough to hear his forgiveness. Pause long enough to hear his acceptance of you despite your failings and despite your weaknesses. Confession isn't a guilt trip. Confession is a doorway to renewal. Confession is a moment when we can be honest with God and say, "Look, I've got all this mess in my life, all this mess in my past." And then we leave it with God and we allow him to remake us so that he can then send us out to be effective in the world for him. And thirdly, when you are called by God, you learn to see the world differently. After Isaiah sees God and faces himself, it's then that he hears the call to be sent out. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8, it says this: "Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?' And I said, 'Here am I. Send me.'" That word "then" really matters. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, because God, first of all, gives Isaiah a new vision of himself. Then he gives Isaiah a fresh understanding of himself. And it says, "And then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send?'" The mission call comes after the new vision of God, and it comes after Isaiah's personal cleansing. Now, here's an interesting thing. Isaiah doesn't actually know what he's signing up for. God doesn't give him any details of the mission. He doesn't give him any guarantees of success. He just kind of has this vague question: "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" And so when Isaiah says yes to God, he says it not because he knows what God's calling him to do, but because he trusts the one who is sending him. Now, that's where ministry really begins, of course. It doesn't begin with certainty, it begins with willingness. Your success in mission and evangelism and following God's call on your life doesn't come about because God has first told you what he wants you to do and he's given you a kind of action plan and a strategy and all the resources to go by. No, you've had a vague call of God on your life. God's just said, "Who shall I send?" And you say, "Here I am, Lord, send me." But your success, your effectiveness is based on the fact that you trust the one who sent you. Does that make sense? So you don't need to wait for a perfect plan from God. You don't need to wait for a job description from him. Just say yes to God's call and trust him to fill in the rest as you go along. Once you've seen God's holiness, once you've experienced his grace, you can't look at the world the same way again. You just want to get out there and you want to undertake ministry in God's name. You see the world for how it truly is. You see its pain. You see the injustices in the world. You see people's hunger for hope, and you just want to do something about it. That's what happens when your sight changes, when your perspective changes through God's call on your life. There is no other option but to respond. So Isaiah's story gives us a fresh understanding of our calling. It's not so much about what we can do for God. It's how we see things that comes first. Have you got a new vision of God? Have you got a new honesty about yourself? Have you got a new willingness to serve the world? When you see things differently, it's then that you can be truly effective for God. So if you want to serve God, if you want to be effective for him, if you want to make a profound and transformative difference in the world, then ask him first to open your eyes so that you can see differently. And when you can see God differently, see yourself differently, and see the world differently, just as Isaiah did, then everything else will follow on naturally from that.